A bromance is a powerful thing. Lennon and McCartney, Holmes and Watson, Gilbert and Sullivan, Hahn and Chewie. But occasionally, a bromance can nearly get you killed. A month ago, the entire world watched transfixed as a former chef named Yevgeny Prigozhin marched with his private army on Moscow. His tanks and his men, the Wagner group, rolled triumphantly towards the Kremlin. The Russian army was not stopping them. At the core of this mutiny is a bromance between Prigozhin and a guy you've probably never heard of, General Sergei Surovkin. Big and bald, Surovkin looks like a bouncer or a wrestler. He wears turtlenecks under his army uniform, which accentuate his double chin. Prigozhin's Wagner army got closer to the Kremlin, and he assumed that his friend Surovkin would swing in to back him up. Things were going very, very well. People were cheering them in the street. Wagner! 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 But Sergei Surovkin flaked on his friend. He told Prigozhin to back off.
I urge you to stop. We mustn't play into the enemy's hands during this difficult moment for the country.
Then he disappeared. This week, Yevgeny Prigozhin attempted a coup, but it was brought to an extremely anticlimactic end. Now both he and his friend are missing. So, how did Prigozhin's bromance with Surovkin nearly bring down the Russian government? Oh, and what's the punishment for even thinking about trying to roll Vladimir Putin? We'll get to that too. That's this week on If You're Listening. Surovkin and Prigozhin became friends in a place where friends are very hard to make. Syria in 2018. You see, there are some jobs that Vladimir Putin wants done, but he doesn't want to be seen doing those jobs. So he sends his private army, the Wagner.
Vladimirovich Putin.
Putin sends these mercenaries anywhere he needs them to do his dirty work.
And you can use them in various places around the world where you don't want to openly admit you're intervening.
Some say the name is because the original founder was a neo-Nazi and Richard Wagner was Hitler's favourite composer. The group leans into this. They refer to themselves as an orchestra, and each mercenary is a musician. I mean, it's cute, but in Syria they established a reputation for absolute brutality. They executed a man they accused of deserting with a sledgehammer. So who conducts this orchestra? Why, it's the mutinous Yevgeny Prigozhin. And Prigozhin is happy to help Putin out. Many years ago, he gave Prigozhin lucrative government catering contracts, which made him a billionaire. To pay Putin back, Prigozhin became kind of a henchman.
So what Prigozhin said is, look, give me the funds to develop your own private army.
Prigozhin leaned right into his new role as an international man of mystery. He apparently has a large collection of fake passports and disguises. His house is full of gold bars, cash in lots of different currencies, a large gun collection, and a giant sledgehammer engraved with the words, "For use in important negotiations." He's a bald Russian Jason Bourne.
Посмотрите на них,
General Sergei Surovkin arrived in Syria under much less secretive circumstances. Vladimir Putin appointed him as the head of Russian military operations in Syria. A very big title and a very big deal. Prigozhin really liked Surovkin, mostly because he really didn't like the guys who were in charge before him. Under them, between 100 and 300 of his Wagner men had been killed in an American airstrike. And they wouldn't give his men military medals for their work. In fact, people close to Prigozhin characterise this as a significant moment in his supervillain origin story. Surovikin's time in Syria was particularly bloody. He oversaw indiscriminate bombings of civilians.
Russian and Syrian planes have stepped up their bombing of Idlib since December.
He did nothing to stop Syrian planes dropping chemical weapons on civilians as well. His tactics in Syria earned him the nickname General Armageddon and pushed him further up the ranks. He was so successful there that Surovikin was considered by many to be the likely next head of the Russian military. Prigozhin and Surovikin built a close relationship. Leaked documents, which appear to be from the Wagner Group, indicate that Surovikin became an honorary Wagner musician while they were working together in Syria. It was a beautiful friendship, which would last right up until one of them attempted a military coup. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Prigozhin and Surovikin were back in Russia and began to step into the limelight. At first, both of them kept their heads pretty low. But as the war started going badly for Vladimir Putin, Prigozhin saw an opportunity.
Yevgeny Prigozhin no longer wanted to be a servant. He wanted to be an equal, arguably a master in some ways.
And he had a master plan for how to do it. In September last year, Prigozhin stood in a prison yard in a city 11 hours east of Moscow. The sky was overcast and he was in a khaki zip-up bomber jacket and shiny black shoes. He was wearing medals given to him by Putin. Inmates stood in a circle around him in navy prison uniforms. He was coming to them with an offer. "I represent a private military company," he said. "You may have heard of Wagner." He introduced his offer like a reality TV host. It's a 6-month game. If you survive to the end, you go home, pardoned of your crimes. There are rules. You don't drink, you don't take drugs, you don't pillage and plunder, you don't have sex with anyone, flora, fauna, men, women, anything. The most important rule is you don't desert, you don't surrender. Once you join, you follow orders, you die. His offer was to join Wagner and fight alongside the Russian army to try and take Ukraine. Despite the risk, thousands signed up. With little training, they were being sent into hell, the Battle of Bakhmut. The city of Bakhmut is about halfway along the 1,000-kilometre front between Russian and Ukrainian forces.
It's the bloodiest battle in Ukraine. Russia's on a mission to make a breakthrough in this war.
Despite its limited strategic value, the battle for Bakhmut has become symbolic for both sides.
Putin had promised it would be taken and put Prigozhin and Surovikin in charge. In fact, Surovikin was put in charge of the entire invasion, much to Prigozhin's delight. Prigozhin issued a statement calling Surovikin a legendary person born to faithfully serve the motherland. He said he was the most competent commander in the Russian army. But Ukrainian troops weren't going to make their job easy.
We won't give up Bakhmut. We will hold on to it until the very last. Glory to Ukraine, death to the enemies.
Ukrainian forces saw Bakhmut as an opportunity to kill as many Russians as possible.
Bakhmut in Ukraine's east has seen some of the fiercest fighting. So much so, it's been dubbed the meat grinder.
Prigozhin sent wave after wave of new Wagner recruits to their deaths. It was chaos. The recruits were terrified. Many tried to desert and were shot.
I know for sure about 3 cases where prisoners who tried to run away from hospitals after being wounded were shot dead. Also, 10 people were shot on the training ground in front of prisoners who just arrived. It was done as a deterrent.
Another deserter was beaten to death with a sledgehammer on camera. When global organisations called Prigozhin a terrorist, he sent them a blood-stained sledgehammer with a Wagner logo and a pile of skulls engraved on it. It came in a violin case to give it a musical touch. As Prigozhin was throwing men into the meat grinder, Sergei Surovkin was getting a taste of reality. Less than a month after he took over command of the invasion, he suffered a serious defeat.
Russian troops captured the port city of Kherson in the early days of their invasion. But Moscow's forces have been ordered to retreat.
A TV broadcast was organised to humiliate him. The Defence Minister, Sergei Shoigu, sat at a long table surrounded by generals. In front of them, as though testifying at his own trial, Surovkin had to explain what had happened and recommend a retreat.
Yes.
Prigozhin backed up his friend, saying Surovkin had shown leadership and spoke like a man who took responsibility for the troops, which was very nice of him. But Surovkin was demoted 2 months later, and command was given to Surovkin's boss, Valery Gerasimov. Prigozhin was furious. His friend had been humiliated and replaced by two men he had a long-standing grudge against, Shoigu and Gerasimov.
The rifts inside Russia's military are growing.
From that point on, everything that went wrong for Prigozhin was Shoigu and Gerasimov's fault.
Yevgeny Prigozhin has well and truly come out into the spotlight, openly criticising Russian military leaders.
He started making videos blaming them for the deaths of his men in Bakhmut.
Shoigu! Gerasimov! Где боеприпасы?
In this video, one of many where he shouts angrily at the military leadership, he's standing in a field strewn with dead Wagner soldiers. He accused Surovkin and Gerasimov of genocide, of cowardice. In the months after Surovkin's demotion, Prigozhin became more and more of a social media star. Once Bakhmut was captured, Russian state media hailed Wagner men as heroes and Prigozhin as a genius. At first, this was fine with Putin. As long as he doesn't get caught in the crossfire, he doesn't care if his henchmen bicker.
In other words, as long as Putin can keep the camps around him divided rather than united, as long as he keeps them divided, he protects himself.
But Prigozhin had become quite unhinged by what he'd seen in Bakhmut and by the treatment of his friend Surovkin. Finally, when Prigozhin did an interview railing against the elite of Russia, daring them to send their children to war and saying rampant inequality would lead to another Russian revolution, Putin saw him as a threat. It was a comically large Zoom call which seemed to include everybody in Russia except Prigozhin and Surovkin. In it, the top army brass announced they would be taking Prigozhin's men away from him, absorbing them into the army. At this point, it seems like Prigozhin snapped. He concocted a plan to kidnap Shoigu and Gerasimov, but he couldn't do it alone. He started sounding out support from some top generals, including possibly his friend Surovkin. Unfortunately for both Surovkin and Prigozhin, Russian intelligence services knew it was coming. When Prigozhin realised that he was blown, he decided to YOLO it and march on Moscow. Prigozhin's men marched into the military headquarters of the Ukraine operation, cheered on by local Russians. He then parked his butt on a public bench and demanded Shoigu and Gerasimov come join him, or his men would come to Moscow to get them. At this point, it seems that Sergei Surovkin got a tap on the shoulder from the FSB, that is Russia's security service. That's really the worst tap on the shoulder that anyone can get anywhere. The FSB appears to have detained him, taken him to an interrogation room and asked him some questions. Then, as Prigozhin's men hit the road towards Moscow, Surovkin was given a job. Tell him to stop. With an uncharacteristic 5 o'clock shadow, a gun on his lap, and an awkward tone in his voice, Surovkin was filmed in a small, white-walled room asking Wagner to head back to their base and submit to Putin's orders. The jig was up. Whatever support Prigozhin was hoping to get from his old friend Surovkin was clearly not coming.
But just a few hundred kilometers from Moscow, Yevgeny Prigozhin ordered his troops to turn back.
These two men, both supporters of Vladimir Putin, have created a situation more dangerous than anything the president has faced before. The dispute, which is basically an internal one among the guys leading the invasion of Ukraine, spilled over into public chaos. So, of course, there have to be consequences. Let's start with Surovkin.
Sergei Surovkin, the Russian general believed to have known about the mutiny beforehand, hasn't been seen in public in days.
The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times report that he has been detained in Moscow and repeatedly interrogated by the FSB. The official line is that he is resting. And you would think that things would be even more terrifying for Prigozhin, the architect of all this chaos.
If I were he, I'd be careful what I ate. I'd be keeping my eye on my menu.
You would be wrong, though. Things keep getting better for Prigozhin. Initially, it was all treason charges and raids of his house and living in exile, but within days, he was invited to FSB headquarters to pick up all the guns, disguises, passports, gold bars, and cash they'd found at his house.
Спасибо.
Then, he and 35 top Wagner guys were invited to the Kremlin for a 3-hour meeting with Vladimir Putin. How nice! And then, for all we know, he went back to work. His Wagner group has resumed operations in Africa, with more recruits arriving in recent weeks.
He will try to minimise the political damage, which he is now demonstrating, sending the message that Wagner mercenaries are patriots.
It really seems like Vladimir Putin is trying to just pretend this never happened. But it did happen. Everyone saw it. Since the mutiny, several senior Russian army officers have been mimicking Prigozhin and posting criticism of the top brass online. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are moving in to try and recapture Bakhmut, making all of this pointless. Except that Putin has shown weakness. And when you're an autocrat, weakness is never good.